Sweeney. I'm Missouri Bicentennial Coordinator for the State Historical Society of Missouri, and I appreciate you being here together for 21 Fest. It's been a great opportunity to sort of reflect on all the great bicentennial projects, programs, and events that have been happening over the last several years as we approach Statehood Day on August 10th. As many of you know, the Bicentennial Alliance was formed early in 2018 of statewide nonprofit organizations with the goal of promoting, pushing, and really kind of putting some statewide programming together. And Kinner Institute on Constitutional Democracy was, I think, among the first 5 of those organizations. And they fulfilled a really important role, I think, in the bicentennial altogether, which was to have us think about the Missouri crisis. And its impact, and not just, just certainly thinking about it historically, but really kind of rethink how we've talked about the Missouri statehood process. A fire bell in the past was the overarching project, and Jeff, you'll probably talk a little bit about this, but emerged out of a conference that happened in February of 2019 that brought scholars from across the country here to Columbia to present new scholarship on the Missouri statehood process. And that came together in an edited volume that's been put together by Dr. Pasley and Dr. Hammond. So Dr. Pasley is here to talk a little bit about it, and Dr. Hammond is coming. Will you be doing a discussion, I'm guessing? Hey, it is the magic of the 21st century that we were able to do this. So, Dr. Pasley is professor of history and associate director of the Kinner Institute on Constitutional Democracy at the University of Missouri. Dr. Hammond is associate professor of history and assistant director of academic affairs at Penn State University in New Kensington. And both of them, like I said, had a hand on editing the volume that was just recently published, called A Fire Bell in the Past, Volume 1 on the Missouri Crisis. The book is available for purchase afterwards. So with no further ado, I will introduce Dr. Pasley.
Thanks, Michael. Take off the... I assure you we are adequately socially distanced in this room, so I will try to talk without having this, try to talk unimpeded. You put both, there we go. I have to thank Michael Sweeney and the State Historical Society of Missouri for hosting this whole thing and for being such great partners in the Bicentennial Alliance and for letting this book be part of it, even though as historians, Craig and I are more ruiners of things than celebrators of things. But I still think there's some things at least to celebrate and commemorate. But I'm going to say I'm going to talk a little bit, then I'm going to turn it over to Craig Hammond, my colleague, and then we'll just try to either take questions or have discussion for the rest of this 50 minutes. So Michael mentioned, we got Craig's up there now. All right, let's go back to the PowerPoint. Hey, Craig. All right, say hello to Craig Hammond. Let's go back to the PowerPoint now. All right, there we go. So we've got there is the program from the conference that this started all with, and the volume 1 of our book, Fire Bell in the Past. That's going to be volume 2 coming out probably in December. And those of you who aren't involved in scholarly publishing, I think it's actually something of a triumph of the human spirit that this whole thing went from conference to 2 books in like 2 years. I've actually been involved in things like this that took more like 12. You know, that I wasn't in charge of. I'm not saying I did that, but these things can take a long time. But we had a deadline, which was 2021, and we largely seem to have met it. Anyway, so we're here to celebrate the bicentennial of Missouri today, but I'm sorry to say that it was not so universally celebrated back in the 1800s. One could go on with the unsuperlatives. Black poet E.P. Rogers remembered it as the devil's claim, or more specifically, agreeing to let Missouri in the Union is countenancing the devil's claim. Missouri's northern supporters in Congress earned the mean nickname Doughfaces as in faces shook like dough, which became a watchword not only for Northern supporters of the South, but for moral cowards in politics for much of the 19th century. Historians, as Michael Sweeney alluded to, have taken to calling these events the Missouri Crisis, a profound political and moral test that neither our state or the nation acquitted itself very well in the face of. As we put together first the exhibit with the Missouri Humanities Council and the conference that led to the books that we're discussing today, some of us around the Kinder Institute took to calling these commemorations the Cricentennial, because it was clear. Thanks. Somebody laughed at that. It was like we thought it was very funny, but it's like and somehow we didn't actually manage to call it that, because that seemed to capture the fact that we were celebrating statehood, but really we were talking about trying to call people's attention to this larger set of events that statehood was really just the catalyst for and part of. Now, I found most civilians don't recognize the term Missouri Crisis, or they actually tend to think it's a reference to Ferguson or some other time. I mean, Missouri has had a few crises, so it's understandable that if you're not a 19th century historian, might not be where your mind would go to. So I guess it's worth explaining why historians have come to use that language. And to make a long story short, there was like a 30-page part of the historiographic essay in the book where we do explain this. It kind of has to do with the fact that the way that slavery has come to be increasingly at the fore of interpretations of American political history, not just in the Civil War period, but even back in the founding era and the earlier 19th century. So that once you see it in that sense, that the term crisis rather than compromise or the Missouri question like they used at the time, controversy, it seemed to rise to a more important turning point in American history, and in some ways, for want of a better one, one goes to crisis. But how specifically do we come to use that language? Well, for starters, this was the messiest and longest statehood process up to that time, taking more than 2 years and not one but two Missouri compromises to calm things down. And we can talk in the questions about the second Missouri Compromise someone wants to hear. It was probably the biggest national debate the country had had since the ratification of the Constitution. And it's sort of hard to capture, but there really hadn't been that many national debates up until 1819 that kind of spilled out into other media, where people started writing books about it, and where the political world and a lot of the way the government did things really started to kind of bend around this. This is kind of barely in the book, but one anecdote about this is like this: the Missouri Crisis is the time when the U.S. Census changed to actually start counting people, actually start counting demographics more thoroughly, because so many of the debates turned over where the free black population was and where it was moving. So this, among other things, it became there had been so many sort of statistical claims and historical claims being made in the Missouri debates that it actually kind of changed it's kind of one of the first steps towards, I guess, in some ways it's like the first steps toward the world of dueling government statistics that we now live in happened in the wake of the Missouri Crisis. The final resolution, 1821, calmed things down and let Missouri in the Union, yet left behind some devastating legacies. I remember. Here we go. This is something in the book from a later period. It's called The Moral Map of the United States, and it was something that was first published in 1837, but then was kind of republished in various forms by the abolitionists throughout the mid-19th century. And as you can see, Missouri falls on the wrong side of that, and in fact, you have the quotation down below said it's a dark face on it's a dark spot on the faces of the nation, and the state of things cannot always exist. That is this moral division. That's from the Marquis de Lafayette. So that's a sort of illustration of the division that's left behind. So one legacy was that slavery, unfreedom, was officially extended into America's future west of the Mississippi, rejecting the promises of liberty and equality that many Americans thought had been made in the Declaration of Independence. And one of the things that I got something in the wrong order there. There we go. One of the things that was the Declaration of Independence was particularly unluckily for Missouri, the Declaration of Independence was particularly on people's minds around the time of around 1819. There had just been this fancy print done that was widely sold around by a radical printer named John Benz. And you can't really see it in this version. You can see that it's lavishly illustrated with all the founders. You know, it's sort of an early gathering of the founders type illustration. And you can't really see it on this, but there's a part up above where he's highlighted certain words. And one of the very few phrases that's highlighted in it is all men are created equal. So it was very much a statement of this, reminding people about the promises of liberty and equality in the Declaration of Independence that didn't seem to be followed. Another bit of publicity the Declaration of Independence was getting in 1819 was that happened to be the year that the John Trumbull's painting of the Declaration of Independence was installed in the Capitol. So literally, Missouri's application's coming up, and they're just looking at this painting that was just put in, which made at least some people think that, wow, this promise has been made, and we're really not following this if we allow what people thought of as the future of the country beyond the Mississippi to include slavery. Now, that's even though it already did, right? I mean, and that's one thing, Craig will probably address this in his section, but one thing that's important to note about this is that Missourians understood, the Southerners who had moved to Missouri, slavery has existed beyond the Mississippi for a long time. They're not as aware of that in the Northeast, or at least they wish to just forget that and think of this free and actually probably white future in the Midwest, in the West beyond the Mississippi. We Midwesterners like to think of ourselves as children of the pioneers, and that's definitely been part of this bicentennial celebration. Many folks here of a certain age may remember the old Daniel Boone TV show where the theme song claimed that the area's first U.S. settler was a big man who fought for America to keep all Americans free, and then shunk, hit the tree with the axe. And of course, here's got these some of my collection of Daniel Boone stuff here. There's the one that is kind of most famous and most most related to this concept. In fact, like lots of other Kentuckians and Virginians, and not pictured in this, and as is really not pictured in George Caleb Bingham's painting or in the old Fess Parker TV show, the Boone family came and forced their enslaved African-American workers to come west too, to do much of the hardest work. And the resolution of the Missouri crisis meant that many, many thousands of others would be forced to do the same. If you go out to the Boone's Lick State Historic Site, it is mentioned there, but it's maybe not something that we think about enough, that the work of doing things like digging salt licks was something that would be done by enslaved people who were forced to come, and probably to leave friends and family behind in Virginia or Kentucky or wherever they came from back east. The first state constitution, which necessitated the second Missouri Compromise, locked in a legacy of racism too, trying to block free black people from ever entering the state, though that hardly worked. The other legacy was the division between slave and free states that would only be broken down with the massive bloodshed of the Civil War. Now, I got to go back because I got these slightly in the wrong order. but there we go. That division between slavery and free states had not really existed at the time of the American Revolution, because at that point slavery was practiced everywhere, in New York and New Jersey, even Rhode Island and Connecticut. I always liked there were tobacco plantations with slave labor in Rhode Island, for instance. It was only during and after the Revolution, as you can see on the map that I have up, that abolition and gradual emancipation laws were put in place across the North. Even then, and the difference started to emerge. You can see there's some states, the New England states, they got rid of slavery usually by some kind of constitutional decision, judicial decision. It was sort of abolished immediately. In the mid-Atlantic states, where there was a larger enslaved population, they did these gradual emancipation laws. Of course, the Old Northwest, famously, slavery was at least theoretically banned by the Northwest Ordinance. So these differences emerged after the Revolution, just in time for Missouri to apply for statehood. Those differences had rarely showed. I mean, they did show up in national debates, but not in a way that dominated patterns until Missouri's application for statehood. It was this growing regional divergence that produced the conditions for the Missouri crisis. Without being noticed too much in Missouri territory, a fairly significant level of anti-slavery sentiment had grown up across the North. The expectation in places like New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and New England was that slavery was on its way out, thanks to the Declaration, the Constitution, at least their thoughts about the Constitution, the Northwest Ordinance, and these gradual emancipation laws that I was talking about. The international slave trade had ended in 1808. The free black population was growing rapidly in the North. Some were becoming prosperous business people and professionals, and even voters in some states, especially states that still had property requirements, where if you were wealthy enough, you could vote. Yet there were also growing signs that slavery might be getting bigger than ever, especially as new lands opened up in the West after the War of 1812. And go back to this westward movement map where you can see the dates of the different states and how all the states during the 1810s and how Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana are new states. A lot of Georgia and South Carolina was still opening up at that point. And there were, it was clear that there were large numbers of slaveholders and enslaved workers were on the move or being forced to be on the move. The market, because of all these new lands where cotton was being grown, for one thing, the market for enslaved workers was booming, and the supply was coming from within the United States. Let me skip over Daniel Boone. Sorry, I really did try to get this correct. And so here's a map of the internal slave trade, and yeah, I don't know if that's going to work right either in this form. Seems to have. You can also see behind that there's a map of how slavery had spread out between 1790 and 1820 into places like Missouri, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. So there was clearly this internal slave trade was developing, and along with the westward migration of white slave owners and the forced migration of their enslaved people. There were scandals over the fact that large numbers of enslaved people were being sent west, sometimes by fraud or kidnapping, and sometimes because greedy whites sold people who were about to be freed by emancipation laws. And one of the documents of this, there's a slave trading in Missouri. One of the documents of this scandal is a book called by a man named Jesse Torrey called Portraiture of American Slavery, where he had some kind of imaginative, based on true stories, but imaginative illustrations and of things that were happening. This is some enslaved people and angels celebrating the burning of the White House, during the War of 1812. On the right, there's a picture of a woman trying to commit suicide because she was about to be sold to the West as part of this internal slave trade. And there's newspaper stories all over in the period when Missouri's applying for statehood. So it was these kind of northern concerns over the situation of slavery that they thought when it was supposed to be going away, that wasn't going away, that first sparked the Missouri crisis. One of the chapters in our book profiles newly elected Congressman James Tallmadge Jr. Finally got one of these in the right place. General Talmadge, they called him, for his service in the War of 1812. During the war, Talmadge had been embarrassed by British criticism of Americans' hypocrisy about being for freedom but holding slaves, and was frightened by the enemy's ability to recruit black Americans to their cause by offering freedom, which happened during the Revolution and happened again during the War of 1812. Talmadge was also from a part of New York where slavery was just ending and free blacks were the swing voters in some areas. He proposed an amendment to Missouri's statehood bill, quite to the surprise of Southerners and the Missouri people, that banned further introduction of slaves into Missouri and called for a gradual emancipation scheme like the one New York had recently adopted and which seemed to be working in New York. Missourians and Southerners got the real shock of their lives when that bill passed the House of Representatives, where the North now dominated with its larger free population, and because there had really recently been a huge turnover, the biggest turnover in congressional history had just happened before this, actually because of the reaction to a congressional pay raise. But suddenly there was this majority that was voting against slavery, and that's not exactly the right vote, but it's an easier to see map than some others I have of the type of vote that emerged on the Talmadge Amendment. And that, of course, is the bicentennial the Christennial that we were celebrating when we had our conference in February 1819 was actually, it was like, Bill was there, it was like a foot of snow, it was like -5 or something. I don't know if it was minus, am I exaggerating? Maybe it was 10 degrees. But we had a conference on the bicentennial of the actual bicentennial of the Talmadge Amendment, because that's what we said we were going to do. Promises delivered. Because we thought it was important. I mean, part of this book is, and all this whole project is, I've always felt that, like, Missouri's got some good history, it's got some bad history. I feel like we need to own it all. That we need to try to that if there's going to be somebody write big books about the Missouri crisis, that should be us. And so that's kind of the motivation behind a lot of what what transpired here. So it passed the House of Representatives, the Talmadge Amendment does. The Senate stopped the bill, of course, as the Senate does still, right? The Senate stops things. South was stronger there, smaller states were stronger there, but it also stopped Missouri statehood along with it for 2 years, or for a year and then another after that. The debates dragged on for months as Congress deadlocked. The proposed new state of Maine to be carved out of northern Massachusetts in a completely unrelated movement was taken hostage by the South, essentially, as a legislative hostage. It wasn't balanced. It was taken hostage, that they were not going to pass this unless Missouri got to come too. The debates then spilled outside of Congress. Anti-Missouri meetings were held across the North. It's another Talmadge Amendment vote. There's one. It's in the correct place. That's the John W. Taylor's very unknown person, was the sort of anti-slavery Speaker of the House. Later in this period, there's actually a significant political figure from that time that people don't know about. That's New York's finest hotel, where a major anti-Missouri meeting was held that was attended by very prominent people like John Jay, co-author of the Fredler's Papers, and a lot of other people who are less well known today. At any rate, sort of elite Northern opinion, and not probably wider Northern opinion, really got behind, or did not get behind Missouri, got behind stopping slavery in Missouri. These debates were the moment when the North and the South really began to see and hate each other for the first time, when they realized they had a serious disagreement about the future of the country, especially in the West. People on both sides were radicalized to see the lengths that the other side would go to, especially budding abolitionists like President John Quincy Adams. The futures they were fighting over include not just freedom versus slavery, but anything that went along with it. Everything that went along with it. Basic demographics, that is a predominantly white versus predominantly black labor force, the level of urban and industrial development, and the possibility of full and equal black citizenship that the country still struggles with over today. Of course, the most fateful and problematic part of the settlement was the dividing line between slavery and freedom that was proposed by Senator Jesse Thomas of Illinois. This is Illinois' great idea, applying to all future northwestern states except Missouri. By drawing the line between slavery and freedom across the West at 36 degrees 30 minutes latitude, our southern border, the compromise line placed Missouri geographically in the north, but essentially grandfathered it into the South culturally and economically. The dividing line idea was the one that left Thomas Jefferson aghast, causing the famous quote that gives our book its name, the title of our book and the conference played off of. This momentous question, like a fire bell in the night, awakened and filled me with terror. I considered it at once as the knell of the Union, a geographical line coinciding with a market principle, moral and political, once conceived and held up to the angry passions of men, will never be obliterated, and every new irritation will mark it deeper and deeper. To which you often say the rest of the history of the 19th century is true that. Missouri was left, and just go back to the moral map where I started, Missouri was left sticking up like a sore thumb of slavery into the prescribed zone of freedom, surrounded by three sides by free territory or foreign territory, so native territory or Spanish territory. This made Missouri into a never-ending battleground between the North and the South. I sometimes say the state the Union couldn't swallow. That might be another book, a book for another time. There was a war when Mormons from New England moved in. There was a long series of court cases, ending with the famous Dred Scott case over what happened when enslaved Missourians spent time in free territory next door. We all know what would happen when the area to Missouri's west opened up for settlement. Bleeding Kansas, as both pro-slavery Missourians and anti-slavery Northerners violently competed for native territory, that they both believed to be rightfully theirs. And as we here in mid-Missouri know well, that was followed by the worst guerrilla warfare to ever take place in U.S. soil, pitting anti-slavery Kansan and German troops against angry Confederate sympathizers and defenders of slavery that saw some of the worst scenes ever generated in the U.S. in terms of civil warfare. That's enough. We could go on. There's 2 volumes of this book, so there's a lot more to say. But that's enough general narrative. What I'd like to do now is turn to the book more specifically. It's one of two volumes that grew out of the 2 different conferences, one here in Columbia and one in New York City. And now I'd like to bring my co-editor, Professor Craig Hammond of Penn State, to say his piece. Craig was one of the leading published experts on the issue of slavery on the frontier, long before I ever got into this bicentennial business. And so, Craig, I wonder if you could talk about what some of the highlights of this book were for you. What are people going to learn?
Certainly, I would love to, and thank you for having me here. First off, everybody can hear me well?
Yes.
All right, great. So what I want to talk about is I want to talk specifically about some of the things that we find here in the book when we go ahead and we read the book. Just give me 1 second here. I'm going to share something from my screen. So when you put together a book like this, as Jeff had mentioned, we had 2 conferences. One took place in Columbia, Missouri. It's much colder and much snowier than I ever expected I would find in Columbia, Missouri. A month or so later, we found ourselves in New York City. And as a result of those conferences, Jeff and I decided to go ahead and put together this edited volume. And when you put together a book like this, what ends up happening is you have lots of people who presented papers at those conferences submit chapters to become part of this book. And when it was all said and done, we ended up with over 20 really just great chapters. And that presented us with a real dilemma because we had 20 chapters here. You can't have a book that's going to have 20 chapters like this in it. So we decided to do a volume 1 and a volume 2. And even once you decide what's going to be in volume 1 and volume 2, what you really need to do is you need to figure out what's the common theme that runs through all of these chapters that we're going to have in the volume. And it's a lot of work that actually goes into organizing a book like this. Just organizing, deciding what the main themes are going to be, trying to identify certain themes, certain threads that run through. It's a commonality in all of those chapters. And for volume 1, we settled on 3 different main themes. The first theme that we settled on here that I think the readers will really enjoy we're going to learn a lot from. First theme that we have here in part one is going to be our background to the Missouri crises. I open up this section with a chapter that's about the long history of slavery in not just Missouri, but in what becomes Missouri. What is originally French Louisiana, actually what's originally Native American territory, some small settlements that become part of French Louisiana, which then become part of the Spanish province of Spanish Louisiana, and then once it becomes part of the United States as a result of the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. But what you'll find in that chapter there is just how important slavery was in what becomes Missouri for a very long time, long before Missouri even became a state, long before any people from what is now the United States stepped foot in present-day Missouri. Something else we have in that section there that I think is going to be of interest to our readers is this great historian, Bobby Lee. Bobby Lee's from the United States. He's now a professor at Cambridge University over in England. It was a real delight actually having him here at this conference in Columbia in 2019. But our friend Bobby, his chapter is on the great land rush that kicks off what eventuates in Missouri statehood in 1818, 1819, 1820, 1821. Where you are right now, where the folks right now are in Columbia, in that general area in central Missouri, it was Native American territory in 1812. It was Native American territory as late as 1815. And Bobby does a really great job of detailing for us how, under the guise of William Clark, how the United States ends up acquiring this territory through hook and crook, really, from Native Americans, which then gives rise to what is probably the largest single population growth that takes place anywhere in the world up to that date. Brunswick was kind of the center of the universe in 1817, in 1818, 1819, periods like that. Bobby gives us a really great example of how and why all of this ends up happening. I look at the part of slavery. Bobby Lee looks at the part of where the lands open up and where settlers come from. And Jeff does a great job of doing something different for us in his chapter in this section. Bobby and I asked the question about how and why does slavery become so important to white people in Missouri in the 1810s. Jeff goes ahead and addresses the question for us about why Northern white people all of a sudden care about slavery in 1819 when Missouri applies for statehood. You go to the northern states in 1790, most white people in the northern states don't care all that much about slavery one way or another. By 1819, when Missouri applies for statehood, lots of white people in the northern states care about slavery a lot. They care about slavery in places like Missouri. And they're willing to do enough into it that what eventuates in this is really a 2-year struggle for statehood. It's not natural, it's not inevitable that northern whites would be opposed to slavery. It's not natural or inevitable that northern whites would be opposed to slavery in a place like Missouri. But Jeff's chapter really helps us understand how and why that ends up happening. It's going to be the first chapter, or the first part of this book for us that, I think our readers will really enjoy. Second part of our book here is about the national implications of the Missouri crises. Missouri is a very important place in 1819, in 1820. We have 3 great authors who give us an example about why Missouri is so important in the politics of all of the United States in 1819, 1820. Krista Dirksaida, who's a professor who was actually at the University of Missouri for a couple of years, she gives us a great example of how Southern white slaveholders think about Missouri and what it means to them. John Van Atta, another great professor here, shows to us why Southern white politicians and why Southern white slaveholders are so concerned about these Talmadge amendments. James Talmadge, as we saw, proposes that Missouri gradually abolish slavery as a condition of statehood. That doesn't happen. Congress never passes that law. Congress doesn't pass that law because Southern slaveholders are so outraged by that law. And John Van Atta lets us understand why Southern slaveholders are so concerned about preserving slavery in a place like Missouri. When we read John Van Atta's chapter, I think we get a really good sense, really good understanding of why Southern slaveholders become so committed to defending slavery. Southern slaveholders, as John Van Atta and as Don Radcliffe show us, they could have consented to some kind of restrictions on slavery in Missouri in 1819. It's probably the last chance for the United States to do something meaningful about slavery. It's probably the last chance for the United States to put slavery on the road to a very long, very gradual abolition in the United States. That doesn't happen. It doesn't happen because Southern white slaveholders block it. John Van Atta and Donald Radcliffe they really help us understand why that happens. And at least from my perspective, one of my favorite parts of the book is going to be in part 3. The first 6 chapters that we have there, they focus on places more than they focus on specific individuals. They focus on institutions like the presidency or Congress rather than particular individuals. But what's really special about this book, especially for an academic work like this, is that the final 5 chapters all focus on individuals. We have some great, really biographical chapters here. Again, as historians, as I said earlier, the question we like to address as historians is, how and why does this happen? Another question we like to address is, why is this significant? Why does this matter in the big scheme of things? We take the first chapter we have there by Sarah Gronenscheder. She's a fantastic professor at the University of Pennsylvania. And she does a great biography. And it's really the first ever biography on James Talmadge Jr. James Talmadge Jr. is the individual who introduces these Talmadge events. And as a good historian, we want to know, why does he do this in the first place? Why does this happen in 1819 when it doesn't happen at some other point in time? And as Sarah tells us in this, is that, when James Talmadge, when he's in Congress, when he looks at Missouri, he sees a lot of similarities between Missouri in 1819 and the New York that he grew up in 30 years earlier. James Talmadge himself was a slave owner, as Sarah shows us. He was a slaveholder, but he also oversaw and saw the process of gradual emancipation in New York. What Talmadge had seen is how 25 years of a pretty simple gradual emancipation law could nearly eradicate slavery in a place like the Hudson Valley, where slavery was very important in Talmadge's youth. As Sarah shows us, Talmadge looked at the Hudson Valley in New York, he looked at Missouri, and what he decided was that if New York could do this in New York, then Missouri could do this in Missouri, and he could gradually, peacefully abolish slavery in Missouri. How and why Talmadge came to that position, Sarah has some great examples for us. She also shows just how important enslaved African-American men and women are in driving James Talmadge to work for gradual emancipation in a place like Missouri. Probably one of my favorite chapters in this book is the one that's written by Ann Twitty. And Ann Twitty is Jeff, correct me if I'm wrong, she's a 4th generation Missourian or 5th?
And Craig knows this. She's actually going to be here this coming year. So,
that's right. I forgot that.
Filling in
Well,
for
good on the University of Missouri, Columbia, and the Kinder Institute for having Annie there for the academic year. And Jeff, she's a 4th generation Missourian.
I believe so. I don't know the number, Craig. I don't. It could be high. It could be higher.
I promise you that.
It could be higher. I think she and I may be about the same, and I think I'm like 6.
And it was this remarkable enslaved woman by the name of Winnie. And Winnie was originally born in Virginia in the 1770s. She's an African-American woman born enslaved. She moves from, not voluntarily, she's forced to move, separated from her family, moves from Virginia, ends up in Kentucky, and then ends up in Illinois. And from Illinois, she ends up in Missouri. And what Winnie does right around the time of statehood is she sues for her freedom. And she sues for her freedom and the freedom of her children on the grounds that she had lived in Illinois, which at this point is a free state. It takes quite a few years for her case to make its way through the Missouri courts, but in 1824, Winnie wins freedom for herself and for her children. And Annie gives us a remarkable story about how Winnie ends up filing this case, how she navigates through this case, and how ultimately she ends up winning this case. And as Annie points out for us in her chapter here, that Winnie, this enslaved African-American woman, sets the precedent that once you live in a free territory and you're free, you're always free. You can't be re-enslaved in a place like Missouri. That precedent allows hundreds of enslaved African-American men and women in Missouri to gain their freedom one way or another. And that precedent actually stands in Missouri courts until the early 1850s, when it's overturned first by the Missouri Supreme Court and then ultimately by the United States Supreme Court in the infamous Dred Scott decision that's rendered. There's a Dred Scott decision that's rendered in 1852 in Missouri that the Supreme Court then adds to in 1856. But it's not a wonderful story that Andy writes, but it's certainly an interesting story. It's never wonderful to see enslaved people and their travails. It's good to see them get their freedom, but in either case, it's a very compelling story And when you read this, we'll all agree that Winnie is one remarkable woman for what she does. And what's great about that is this isn't about presidents, this is about ordinary people and what they're able to do. And setting in converse to that is a great chapter by a friend of ours by the name of David Gelman. David Gelman looks at John Jay. John Jay is actually one of the original signers of the Constitution of the United States. He's a longtime prominent politician in New York and in the United States. And like many prominent New Yorkers in the 1770s, the 1780s, and the 1790s, John Jay owns a considerable number of enslaved men and women. What David Gelman shows for us is how those enslaved African-American women work to get their own freedom from somebody like John Jay. And then once the Missouri crisis hits, how those enslaved men and women work with John Jay or work on John Jay and his sons to turn them into really genuine advocates of abolition. Advocates of abolition, not just in New York, not just in Missouri, but in all of the United States. What David gives us is, I think, a really great example of what we used to call high and low history. High history of people like John Jay, and the lower history of ordinary people. It's probably not the best term to use there, but nonetheless, it's a fascinating story about how ordinary men and women are able to get themselves out of slavery. Now they're able to really turn themselves into true advocates of emancipation. Rounding out the book here, the two final chapters that we have, David Waldstreicher is a longtime friend of Jeff and I, very accomplished historian, very accomplished author, just a very good author as far as I'm concerned. And David gives us really a fascinating chapter on John Quincy Adams. Everybody here, I'm sure, knows who John Quincy Adams is. His father was the second president of the United States, one of the co-authors of the Declaration of Independence. From the time he's 12 years old, John Quincy Adams is involved in politics or in governance, serving as, for example, his father's secretary, working in various delegations in Europe and stuff like that. For all intents and purposes, John Quincy Adams is involved in politics from the times he's an adolescent. His goal, just like his father's goal, is to become president of the United States. But during the time of the Missouri crisis, he's the Secretary of State. And what David Waldstreicher does for us here is he gives us, really, he traces out very well John Quincy Adams' kind of discovery on his own about how intricately slavery is tied into the United States, how intricately slavery is tied into the Constitution of the United States, how slavery, how really the protection of slavery is interwoven into the institutions of governance in the United States, institutions like Congress, institutions like the presidency. As David Waldstreicher shows us here, John Quincy Adams comes to the recognition that John Quincy Adams can either be opposed to slavery or he can be president of the United States. He can't be both things at once. His ambitions to be president of the United States, his ambitions to do something about slavery are in conflict with one another. And in elucidating what John Quincy Adams goes through, kind of the discoveries of John Quincy Adams, and elucidating that for us, David Waldstreicher does a remarkable job of showing us just how closely slavery is interwoven into the fabric of the early United States. And then finally for us, Andy Shankman, who's a professor at Rutgers University, gives us a wonderful example of the global dimensions of the Missouri crises. As Americans, we tend to think that what happens in the United States only matters in the United States. But as Andrew Shankman shows us, the Missouri crises, it mimics processes that take place across the northern and the southern hemisphere in the 1820s. This is a great example of two political economic thinkers, Daniel Raymond and Matthew Carey, and how they come to terms when they think about how the United States as a union, as a nation state is going to expand, how it's going to grow in the 1820s in political terms and in economic terms, and how slavery plays into that. All told, this is a big, thick academic work, but these 11 chapters are wonderful chapters. They're chapters that I think our audience and our readers here are going to learn a lot about. Further questions?
That's quite readable, and you should definitely go out and buy one in the hallway after this. Do we think we have time for a few questions, right? Does anyone want to ever have a question or a comment about the Missouri crisis or the books or anything else? Andrew? Well, I think that the a couple of things that probably, there's a number of sort of takeaways from this book for us, and I guess something you can take home to people, let people know about is there's a lot of common knowledge that people have about Missouri statehood and about this period that's not necessarily accurate. One thing that I constantly hear is the idea that this started the tradition of balancing states. That was actually, Maine didn't want it. Maine actually came in the Union first. Missouri came in like a year later. And the balance thing only really happened once. It was not a practice that established. And in fact, talking about it that way is a sort of, as they say in like comic books and TV, it's like a retcon to go back and revise the idea that, well, they just found this wonderful compromise and were able to get along with each other. In fact, it was more like they fought to a standstill, shoved it under the rug, and then just went out and started, that is to say, the free states and the slave states constantly competing for new areas. And so, Michigan comes in, Arkansas comes in, Wisconsin. It's not a sense of balance at all. So that's one. I think the other thing, and this is something I feel like I've learned from all this, was just the extent of the anti-slavery movement up to the point that Missouri statehood comes in. That famous abolitionists, that's all later, but there was enough going on to make the Missouri crisis a thing. To make the North had already started to evolve this position, and it wasn't necessarily an exclusively moral one. I mean, it was a moral one, but not exclusively. There was also a whole issue of racism on both sides. But nevertheless, the question of whether slavery, I mean, it's probably a bit hard to see, and Craig and other situations will talk about probably the near impossibility of slavery actually being eliminated. But that's not sort of how it was seen by lots of people in the North up until the time of the Missouri crisis. And I think I actually thought Craig might say this because I think it's in like the first sentence of his essay. And this is the thing that we just have to keep in mind about the debates over Missouri statehood. I mean, there are these constitutional issues for sure, but it's just straight up about slavery and the expansion of slavery. It's time to quit? Oh, okay. Oh, Craig's trying to talk? Oh, thank you. Craig, speak.
All right, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Yeah, I think all you had to do was say, Jeff, go ahead.
I just want to add, I guess, 2 points related to all of this. First, something that Jeff said about the Missouri Compromise. The whole notion that there's this Missouri Compromise that shows the genius of American politics and their ability to compromise. It's really an artifact of the 20th century. So post-World War II in the United States, there's this concern among historians and other scholars to show that the United States has this genius of compromise. And the Missouri Compromise stops being the crises and becomes the compromise largely in the second half of the 20th century. By the time the Missouri Compromise is passed, nobody likes it. White Northerners hate it. White Southerners hate it. Black people hate it. Nobody likes the Missouri Compromise. And the only time it's really even celebrated in American politics is when it's going to be repealed in 1854, at which point Northern whites all of a sudden love the Missouri Compromise because it's about to be repealed. But something else I want to add here about a takeaway.
And the Cold War, right.
Look at the United States in the year 2021. There's a rush. I don't know how deep this goes, but there's certainly a rush in what I see in everyday culture to say that the United States is all good or all bad. And in terms of the Missouri crisis, what that comes down to is a rush to say that the United States is clearly pro-slavery, all pro-slavery, and completely evil. Or a rush to say that, no, look, there's good people who are anti-slavery, and the United States is clearly, even if there's this evil called slavery, there's good people who make the United States fundamentally good because they're opposed to slavery. And, those of us who study the past for a living recognize that the past is never that simple. And if there's one takeaway from this, I think it's that the United States is not wholly pro-slavery and bad. The United States isn't wholly anti-slavery and good. Lots of different people have lots of different positions on this, and they're constantly fighting over it. There is no one United States that's pro-slavery. There's not no one United States that is anti-slavery. What this book shows, I think, to us is that there's constant conflict, constant fighting over slavery, constant fighting over white supremacy in the United States. That theme's very clear in Volume 1. I think it's going to be even more evident in Volume 2.
Craig was sort of referring to something that we actually kind of go into more in the introduction of Volume 2, which we sometimes somewhat cheekily called the 1821 Project, which you'll just have to wait. You'll just have to wait for 6 months before finding out what that's all about. But so will happen. It will be published in 2021, but just barely. But you know, we do what we can. And anyone else from the audience? Good. We have one audience question.
You mentioned the Missouri and Kansas conflict, and we live west, more toward that area, and there are quite a few activities every year regarding that, and I don't know how many books have been written. Robert Frizzell is a historian.
Sure.
He wrote The Independent Immigrant, and
Right.
there's a cemetery that I go to every Memorial Day where I have grandparents, and way back, I don't know how many fourth great-grandfathers who were killed by what they called the bushwhackers, Quantrell's Raiders, Bloody Bill Anderson, probably Jesse James, and quite a few others. It's interesting. Tobey Maguire was in a movie called Ride with the Devil.
I remember it well.
Yeah, and so there's quite a bit of history over there that we find interesting. Emma, Missouri, a little tiny town, has a memorial for those that were killed. And they were German farmers. And then Waverly, Missouri, maybe 15 years ago, erected a statue of General Joe Shelby. He was a Confederate general, and they memorialized him. They had a really big kind of a program and show. He married like his second cousin, and he was 30 or 40 years older than she was. They reenacted that wedding, and it kind of bothers me, but you don't dare go to those and say anything. At least I don't. But I'm just mentioning it as a very interesting. And then after the war was over, many of the people that participated in the killings in the name of reconciliation were appointed as local, well, they called them judges. They weren't actual lawyers, but and they never prosecuted any. They pretty well knew that there were people in the area, English, that participated in it as well, or at least turned their heads. So it was kind of interesting history in that area.
Absolutely, and actually, I have to say, I started out being interested in Missouri history more from that. I mean, I grew up in Kansas, actually, despite I have very deep Missouri roots, but I actually grew up in Kansas, so then as a product of a mixed marriage in that sense, Missouri-Kansas marriage. So I always know. I actually think that people know the Civil War stuff is what in some ways is much better known. Not so much what happened to the Germans, because you're right. I think I know the book you're talking about, and there's like a kind of near genocide of Germans of a certain age during in some of those counties. The Germans, of course, can assuage their feelings by the fact that Germans kept. I always like to talk in class about the Blitzkrieg of Jeff City, right? Like when the war starts, they put a bunch of German troops on a steamboat down in St. Louis and get to Jeff City and seize it before any of the people in Missouri have even organized themselves to know what's happening. So, but the stuff that we're talking about in this, the stuff you can see, this whole idea of it's really in some ways it's the Great Compromise that causes this, because you have this place, St. Louis was a place that kind of in some ways it's a sort of normal northern city, like where there's lots of immigrants moving in, and slavery becomes less and less important. But it's in the middle of this slave state that just creates this contradictions. The contradictions that I think we're all familiar with in Missouri between cities and the rest of the state, and all the different regions that don't necessarily fit together in any very logical way. So thanks for bringing that up. Anyone else? John, are you going to make it?
I'll defer. Real quickly, I know there's not much time left, but
That's okay.
one of the things I liked very much about the book, it kind of dispenses with some old tropes, like the Missouri crisis leads directly to the Civil War, things like that. Can you talk a little bit about the historiography and some of the things that this is kind of a new wave of? It's after a long time, it's just historians taking another look at something that was considered settled, or can you speak to that a little bit?
I think so. Well, with this, one of the things, like in our little it's not little at all, actually. I'm surprised Andrew says it's like a little historiography. It's like, I thought it was like quite long. But so Craig and I would come from, our sort of work, other work, like I've written on the more the Jefferson era, more the 1790s before this, and so we're sort of early Americanists. Sort of, in other words, people are sort of base of knowledge is a bit more in the 18th century and a bit earlier rather than the Civil War. So I would say that what you get in the book is people who know a lot more about the American Revolution and the early and the colonial era, even giving their take on this thing that's kind of traditionally seen, as you say, as a sort of this early precursor to the Civil War, that Civil War historians will kind of do, and they actually kind of poo-pooed it to the most part. It was just kind of like a prologue thing that happened a few years later, and then everything got settled down, and then the real action starts around 1846 or 1850. So we're not treating it as a prologue, obviously. 2 volumes ain't a prologue, and of course there's actually a third in a certain way that another person spoke this morning did. So we're trying to treat what happened in Missouri and the conflict over slavery in the early 19th century and in the founding era really as central, rather than just something that happens later in the middle of the 19th century. If that addresses your question. So, John, have you got one, or are you going to quit a
I was going to actually ask a modern trope question, and that
Please.
is about political polarization. So it's always said that we've never been any more polarized than we are right now.
Oh, well, that's so wrong.
Yeah. So, but could you comment on that as far as the Missouri?
As far as Missouri goes,
Well-
I mean, Missouri's interesting, and I don't think I ever actually got around to writing this in either of the books. Maybe I'll do it some other time. Is that, and Craig in his other book about Missouri wrote a little bit about this. The Missouri actually in itself, it's that they're very keen to show consensus, right? Whether they have to beat people up or scare them into silence, which they do, right? The person from Western Missouri, right? So Smithville, right? So Smithville's founded by this guy named Humphrey Smith, this anti-slavery guy from New Jersey, who was tried to settle, had a farm near Franklin, Missouri, near here, and actually said something about sort of along the lines at a Baptist or Methodist meeting, along the lines of, well, slavery is not that great, is it? Something kind of mild, and then found him, he and his wife got tied up and beaten and warned out of the place, and so he ends up in Smithville because he can't hang around mid-Missouri anymore, because it was just the word went out. And it was partly a matter of politics, where they wanted, there were definitely some anti-slavery people, or people who were, the term they used was restrictionists versus anti-restrictionists. So Missouri had some restrictionists, especially in St. Louis and scattered around. It was definitely probably a minority of the whites, but the word kind of went out that they wanted to project, the leaders of Missouri wanted to project to the idea to the rest of the country, they were just totally united, right? There was just no dissent at all. And they literally, when they vote for the Constitutional Convention, there's like no restrictionist delegates at all get elected. And they kind of, so I guess this is one of the things, this is where I get uncomfortable, actually, John, when people going on too much. I mean, clearly the polarization is out of hand today. I wouldn't deny that, but polarization as a bad thing on its own, you should try and force consensus. That's not so great either. And I would say Missouri, at least the early Missouri, had a bit more of a tradition of enforcing consensus versus fighting. And so obviously they get to fighting during the Civil War era. For a lot of the 19th century and then after the Civil War too, is a lot of until the early 20th century because of the cities. There's a lot of like, oh no, we all agree here. We all agree here. Everyone is, so I don't know if that answers. I mean, on the other hand, of course, politics is vicious, right? There's one of the precursors to the Missouri crisis here is the infamous military election, where the military was called out. There was a contested election in St. Louis between, now I'm going to forget, Rufus, a sort of more Eastern figure, I think Rufus Easton versus John Scott, a Virginian. And Scott lost, and then when they had a rematch, they brought the military out, and it was this kind of scene of actual kind of intimidation scene that the Missouri Gazette, the newspaper, complained about very bitterly, but helplessly. And of course, there's the whole phenomenon of people murdering each other, political candidates and rivals murdering each other, or dueling, as they called it. But when you're 6 feet apart with rifles or whatever it was, in one case, that seems more like murder to me. Craig, have you got anything to? I ranted on there. Have you got anything to add there?
Not much beyond what you said. There's a lot of conflict in Missouri itself. As you said, there's attempts to create consensus. As a historian, it's very difficult to find examples of peoples who oppose to slavery just because the pro-slavery forces are so effective at creating that consensus.
It's not clear how much of the other side ever would have gotten the word out. There's like a meeting in St. Ferdinand, Florence, St. Ferdinand, Florissant. There's an anti-slavery meeting. There's the early anti-slavery leader Benjamin Lundy actually moves from Ohio to try to save Missouri from slavery, and that doesn't go very well for him. Goes back to Ohio, and there's some people in St. Louis, but it's tough going, and you see the end of the whole thing. It's more Thomas Hart Benton and other people kind of bragging about how there's not a single person that dares to speak against them. Anybody else? It's probably time to. We're probably over time, I suspect. Well, I'd like to thank you, Craig, for being on TV, for being on the wall there. I mean, I don't think Craig realizes he's on the wall. That he's in 3 different places, and if I'm looking over this way, it's because I can see Craig here, but I know he's 2 places behind me. So, Craig, you may feel like you're sitting in a room by yourself, but you were actually very prominently featured here. And thanks to Michael and the Missouri Bicentennial and Gary Kramer and the State Historical Society for inviting us, and Andrew Davidson of the Missouri University Press for letting us publish this, like this 2-volume behemoth, which is still very good reading, as Craig said. And that's all. I guess happy Christ Centennial.